Why does it matter that Canada just approved a pipeline heading west instead of south? Here is the answer before we go any further. For 70 years, virtually every drop of oil infrastructure built between Canada and the United States has pointed in one direction, south, deeper into American refineries, American pipelines, American dependency. Mark Carney just approved a pipeline that points the opposite way entirely, west, toward the Pacific Ocean, toward Asia, toward a version of Canada that no longer needs Washington's permission to sell what it produces. Two pipelines, two directions, one country quietly building an exit while the other keeps building the cage. Picture a map of North America for a moment, because this entire story only makes sense once you see the geography clearly. In the northwest corner of Montana, Canadian crude oil currently crosses the border and flows south through American pipeline infrastructure, eventually reaching refineries as far away as the Gulf Coast. Earlier this year, Trump personally signed the order authorizing an expansion of exactly that southward flow, a project called the Bridger Pipeline Expansion, designed to carry 550,000 barrels of Canadian crude every single day deeper into American territory. Trump stood at the signing and said plainly that unlike the previous administration, his government signs pipeline deals, and pipelines are going up. Now look at the other side of that same map, because this is where the story turns. In Alberta, the province producing the vast majority of Canada's oil, a completely different pipeline is now moving forward, one that runs the opposite direction entirely, west across the full width of British Columbia to the Pacific coast. Carney secured an investment agreement with British Columbia's government to build this pipeline, overcoming initial opposition from a province that had resisted similar projects for years. The pipeline is designed to carry 1 million barrels of oil per day, nearly double the capacity of the American-funded expansion moving south, and every single barrel of it is aimed at markets Washington has no say over at all. Sit with that contrast for a moment, because it is the entire story in one image. South, toward more dependency on the United States, 550,000 barrels a day. West, toward independence from the United States, 1 million barrels a day. Canada is not simply diversifying at the margins here, it is building an alternative route with more total capacity than the pipeline expansion the American president personally signed just months earlier. Carney's own words at the announcement make his intent unmistakable. He said the pipeline unlocks the full potential of Canada's natural resources and ensures independence, sustainability, and prosperity for generations to come. And he added that it positions Canada to become the supplier of choice for global allies and partners. Notice the specific language there. Supplier of choice, not supplier of necessity, not the country that has no alternative but to sell everything south because the pipelines only point one direction. This is Carney explicitly reframing Canada's entire relationship with its own oil, from a resource trapped by geography into a resource with genuine optionality. Notice also who stood alongside Carney at that announcement, because the political optics matter here as much as the substance. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith, a conservative leader who has frequently criticized Carney's broader economic policies and clashed with his government on multiple fronts, appeared at the same news conference in visible support of this specific project. That cross-partisan alignment is genuinely rare in Canadian politics right now, where the federal government and Alberta's provincial leadership have spent much of the past year in open conflict over energy policy, environmental regulation, and the broader direction of Canada's economy. When a premier who has been one of Carney's sharpest domestic critics shows up to publicly back a pipeline project, it signals this proposal has cleared a political bar that most previous federal energy initiatives never managed to reach. That unusual alignment between Ottawa and Alberta also explains why this project has a genuinely better chance than the failed proposals that came before it. Northern Gateway and the early struggles around Trans Mountain both suffered partly because Alberta and the federal government were not fully aligned on strategy, leaving the project vulnerable to being caught between competing political priorities at exactly the moments when unified support mattered most. A pipeline with buy-in from Alberta's oil-producing government, British Columbia's coastal government, and the federal government simultaneously represents a fundamentally different starting position than any previous West Coast pipeline attempt in recent Canadian history. Here is what makes this pipeline different from every diplomatic statement or trade negotiation we have covered on this channel so far. Every other episode in the series has involved words, letters, tariff percentages, formal government submissions, arguments about legal basis, and enforcement records. A pipeline is none of those things. A pipeline is concrete and steel buried in the ground, physically incapable of being reversed by a tweet, a press release, or a change in political mood. Once this infrastructure exists, the West Coast route to Asia exists permanently, regardless of who occupies the White House 4 years from now, or what the next round of tariff threats looks like. That permanence is exactly why this specific story carries more long-term weight than almost anything else in this entire trade standoff. Tariffs can be imposed and later lifted, trade deals can be renegotiated and later restructured, but a physical pipeline connecting Alberta's oil fields to the Pacific Ocean, once built, simply exists as a fact on the ground for decades. Washington can threaten new tariffs on Canadian oil next month, next year, or 5 years from now, and every single threat will carry less weight the moment Canada has a genuine, functioning alternative route to sell that exact same oil somewhere else entirely. Let's talk about why this matters so much specifically for oil, rather than any other Canadian export, because the concentration here is almost hard to believe once you see the actual number. More than 90% of Canadian crude oil exports currently ship to the United States, an unusually high concentration, reflecting decades of infrastructure built specifically around continental integration rather than global access. That is not simply a trading preference. It is a structural dependency built directly into the pipes themselves. Canada physically cannot easily sell its oil anywhere else because the infrastructure connecting Alberta to any other market barely exists. This new West Coast pipeline is the first serious attempt in a generation to actually break that structural dependency rather than simply talk about breaking it. To understand how unusual that 90% figure really is, compare Canada's position to virtually any other major oil exporting nation on Earth. Saudi Arabia sells to buyers across Asia, Europe, and the Americas simultaneously, deliberately maintaining relationships with multiple large purchasers, specifically so no single customer ever gains disproportionate leverage over pricing or political conditions. Russia, even under heavy international sanctions, has successfully redirected enormous volumes of crude toward Asian buyers when European markets closed off. Canada, by contrast, has spent decades in the unusual position of being one of the world's largest oil producers while functioning almost like a captive supplier to a single buyer, not because of any formal agreement requiring it, but simply because the pipes only ever pointed one direction. That geographic accident, more than any specific policy choice by any specific government, is what has allowed Washington to treat Canadian oil as a permanent, guaranteed asset, rather than a relationship requiring genuine goodwill to maintain. When your biggest customer knows you have no other buyer capable of absorbing your product at scale, that customer negotiates very differently than one who knows you could walk away to a competing buyer within a reasonable time frame. Carney's pipeline, whatever its ultimate fate, is a direct attempt to remove that specific asymmetry from the relationship permanently. Compare that 90% concentration to how few options Canada has had historically when Washington decides to apply pressure through oil specifically. Every previous episode of this series has shown Washington using its position as the overwhelming buyer of Canadian oil as leverage, whether through direct tariff threats or through the broader psychological reality that Canada has nowhere else to sell its most valuable export in bulk. A pipeline capable of moving 1 million barrels a day to the Pacific does not eliminate that leverage overnight, but it puts a hard ceiling on how far that leverage can actually be pushed before Canada has a genuine alternative sitting right there, already built, already operating. Now let's look at the American side of this same map, because Washington's own pipeline strategy reveals something important about how seriously it takes the risk of Canada actually diversifying away. The Bridger pipeline expansion that Trump personally approved is not simply about moving more oil. It is about deepening exactly the kind of dependency Carney's West Coast project is designed to escape. Every additional barrel flowing south through new American infrastructure represents another barrel more difficult to redirect elsewhere later, another dollar of investment tied specifically to the assumption that Canadian oil will keep flowing in one direction, permanently, regardless of how the broader trade relationship evolves. In other words, Washington is racing to build more infrastructure locking Canadian oil south. At almost the exact same moment, Carney is racing to build infrastructure that breaks that lock entirely. This is not a coincidence of timing, and treating it as one would miss the actual strategic contest happening underneath both announcements. Whichever pipeline gets built and operational first effectively sets the terms of the relationship for decades, because pipeline capacity, once constructed, tends to stay in use for the full economic lifetime of the asset, often 40 years or more. If the American-funded southward expansion becomes fully operational years before Carney's westward pipeline does, that additional capacity reinforces exactly the dependency structure Washington benefits from having in place before any serious alternative exists. If Carney's pipeline reaches completion first, or even roughly in parallel, Canada enters future trade negotiations with genuine leverage it has never had before in the modern era of this relationship. Timing then becomes the entire ballgame here, and the honest picture is not simple. The American Bridger expansion is targeting construction starting as early as 2027, with potential operations beginning around 2029. Carney's West Coast pipeline is even earlier in its process, having just secured its core investment agreement with British Columbia, meaning it faces its own lengthy road through further permitting, financing, and construction before a single barrel ever reaches the Pacific coast. Neither project is close to actually moving oil yet, which means this entire contest is currently being fought on paper and in political announcements rather than in actual operating capacity. That timing gap is exactly why the messaging around both projects matters as much as the physical construction itself. Carney needs Canadians and international observers to believe the West Coast pipeline represents a genuine, credible path toward independence, because that belief itself functions as leverage in trade negotiations happening right now, years before the pipeline could possibly be finished. A country perceived as having a credible alternative can negotiate more firmly than a country everyone knows is bluffing, regardless of how many years away that alternative actually sits from full operation. There is a reason skepticism around this specific pipeline promise runs deep inside Canada itself, and it would be dishonest to tell this story without acknowledging it directly. Canada has attempted West Coast pipeline projects before, and the track record is not encouraging. The original Northern Gateway pipeline proposal, meant to carry Alberta oil to the Pacific coast through northern British Columbia, was formally rejected years ago after fierce opposition from Indigenous communities and environmental groups concerned about tanker traffic along the coastline. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, a smaller scale version of this same West Coast ambition, only reached completion after the federal government took the extraordinary step of purchasing the entire project outright when private investors abandoned it amid overwhelming regulatory and political obstacles, ultimately costing taxpayers many billions of dollars beyond original projections. That history matters enormously for judging how much weight to put on this new announcement. British Columbia's government did not simply wake up one day and decide to support Alberta oil crossing its territory. This represents a genuine political reversal from a province that spent years actively blocking similar projects. And reversals like that can prove fragile if provincial political leadership changes or if organized opposition mounts the same kind of sustained resistance that killed the Northern Gateway proposal entirely. Carney's team clearly understands this risk, which is likely why the announcement emphasized securing British Columbia's investment agreement specifically, treating provincial buy-in as the critical first hurdle rather than simply announcing federal intent and hoping provincial cooperation would follow later. Let's walk through where this genuinely goes from here, because there are three realistic paths, and each one changes how much this pipeline story actually matters to the broader trade standoff we have been tracking across this entire series. Scenario 1. Both pipelines eventually get built roughly in parallel, meaning Canada ends up with genuinely expanded capacity in both directions. More oil flowing south into American refineries and more oil flowing west toward Asian markets simultaneously. In this outcome, Canada's overall leverage improves modestly without dramatically restructuring the relationship, because the American market remains enormous and valuable even as a smaller share of Canada's total exports, while the West Coast route provides a real but partial hedge against future pressure. Scenario 2. Permitting delays, environmental opposition, or financing troubles slow Carney's West Coast project significantly, while the American-funded southward expansion proceeds largely on schedule. This is the scenario Washington would clearly prefer because it would mean the dependency structure deepens before any credible alternative exists, giving the United States continued outsized leverage over Canadian oil exports well into the next decade, regardless of how the current tariff dispute resolves. Scenario 3. This is the version that would represent the most significant shift in the entire relationship we have covered across this series. Carney's pipeline reaches completion on an accelerated timeline. Asian buyers commit to long-term contracts, locking in demand before the pipeline even opens, and Canada enters the next major round of trade negotiations with the United States, holding something it has never genuinely held before, a real physical operating alternative to selling its most valuable resource through American pipelines alone. In that scenario, every future tariff threat targeting Canadian energy carries dramatically less weight because the underlying structural dependency, the threat depends on, no longer fully exists. Here's the question worth sitting with as you watch both of these projects move through their own separate approval processes over the coming years. Does infrastructure actually change the balance of power between two unevenly matched trading partners, or does it simply take so long to build that the political moment it was designed to address has already passed by the time a single barrel actually moves through the new pipe? History offers examples of both outcomes. Some infrastructure investments genuinely reshape a relationship permanently, Others become expensive monuments to a political moment nobody remembers by the time construction finally finishes. Think about how differently this entire trade standoff would read 5 or 10 years from now under each possible outcome. If this pipeline gets built and Asian buyers genuinely diversify Canada's customer base, future historians covering this exact period of Trump era tariff threats might describe them as the catalyst that finally forced Canada to break a 70-year pattern of continental dependency. It had always known was a strategic vulnerability, but never had sufficient political will to actually fix. If the pipeline stalls the way Northern Gateway stalled, this same period gets remembered instead as one more failed attempt at diversification, another press conference promising independence that never actually arrived before the political moment moved on to the next crisis. Here is my honest read on where this specific contest lands. Carney's West Coast pipeline matters most right now as a credible signal rather than an immediate operational reality. And that signal alone is already doing real work inside ongoing trade negotiations because Washington now has to negotiate with a Canada that at least appears to have options rather than a Canada everyone assumes has none. Whether that signal eventually becomes genuine physical leverage depends entirely on execution over the next several years, permitting, financing, construction, none of which is guaranteed simply because an investment agreement was signed and a press conference was held. Watch British Columbia specifically over the coming months because provincial politics killed similar pipeline proposals in the past. And the durability of this newly secured agreement will say more about the project's real chances than anything announced at a single press conference. And watch whether Asian buyers actually commit real long-term purchase agreements to this pipeline before it is even built. Because contracted demand locked in years in advance is the strongest possible signal that this project will actually reach completion rather than stalling the way so many previous Canadian pipeline proposals have stalled before it. Tell me in the comments below, does a pipeline pointed toward Asia actually give Canada real leverage against Washington, or is this simply a political announcement that takes so many years to matter that it becomes irrelevant by the time oil actually flows through it? Does geography eventually bend to political will? Or does political will simply run out before the concrete gets poured? And if you want to know whether this pipeline survives the provincial politics and environmental opposition standing between today's announcement and an actual operating pipeline, make sure you are subscribed because that is the story that will actually determine who wins this particular chess match.